Sundance Kid, you ever see that movie? Greatest movie ever? The Sundance Kid has to move to shoot. I'm better when I move to shoot. So, today we're going to be doing, begin a long program in theology, art, and culture. And this is going to be a little bit different than last year's program, which is where we went sequentially through some material. We're going to actually be drawing some different connections between theology, art, and culture all the way through in different ways. And the reason why we did that is it's going to be a little more episodic. It's going to be a little more like, where are we is not going to always be clear in terms of which century, which era, which art form. We're going to do some focus on icons in about 3 weeks. But we're also going to, when we get to Christmas time, I've arranged for a professor of art to come in to do a presentation on the theological history of stained glass, and to do a special presentation on Handel's Messiah in stained glass. So today's presentation is a little different in that we're going to be jumping way into the front to look at contemporary art, and particularly art around ritual. And the reason why we're doing that is this is part of the conference that I'm giving at the DIA tomorrow. And we have 439 people signed up for that conference. And so I'm petrified. And so I have to speak to all of them, and I thought this will be one more rehearsal that I can do with you all. So I hope that that's okay. But I also think it's important because not everybody here is probably going to be able to be at that conference. And so this will help us to do that. And so basically, this theme, this conference is called Art as Ritual, and I want to answer 4 questions today. The first is say, how did we get here? How did this conference come to be? And it came to be when I became friends with a local artist named Orrin Goldenberg. And Orrin was a Kresge award-winning artist who had an installation in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. And in that installation, he had documented all of these rites of lamentation that took place at the Douglas Towers, which was the part of the Brewster Douglas Tower. They were part of the Brewster homes, which were built from 1935 to 1955 in an area that we know as Black Bottom. And this was the first public housing built in the United States for African Americans primarily, although it was a racially mixed population there. And over time, the Brewster homes, which had once been home for celebrities like Diana Ross and Joe Louis, Lily Tomlin was in the Brewster homes, in one section of the Brewster homes. Over time, those towers became derelict. That doesn't mean that they weren't inhabited. And in 2014, the city decided to raze them, to demolish them. And so Goldenberg filmed all of these rites of mourning that took place surreptitiously at the Douglas Towers. And so, and then he set up an installation in which you would walk into a dark room and you'd have this sculpture in which you could take a piece of brick from the sculpture that looked exactly like the Douglas Towers. And in the midst, when you would pick up that brick, he had it timed or weighted in such a way that it would trigger different montages. And the reason why he did that is he wanted to convey the point that there are times in which our narratives break down and that our ability to tell a story becomes impossible, but there are in certain rites and rituals a kind of healing that occurs. And so this is what would happen is you would walk into this scene and you'd see this incredible piece, and you have all these montages around you, and here is a kind of sculpture that looks just like the Douglas Towers did. And then as you would do it, you'd get this. Let me just make sure this comes on.
shall see his face. I shall see his face. When it's all over.
So what I saw in that movement, and that just gives you 1 minute, I saw these layerings of rituals that were helping a community change and survive and become adaptive and reform. So one of the reasons why we're doing Art as Ritual is because we wanted to provide an opportunity for artists who are resonating with those kinds of ideas and themes. And the next reason, I guess, is because Orrin and I developed this deep friendship. Orrin is a practicing Jew, and he does most of the rituals at the downtown synagogue, even though he's an artist. And I am a practicing religious person who has artistic interests. And we spend time together, and the way we become friends is we do projects together that matter. And finally, we wanted to make a couple of statements about rituals that became clear in the work that we were doing. And the first is that, oops, there we go. So there's another piece of Requiem for Douglas. This is a dancer who was 13 years old at the time of this. Just unbelievable work. You see some other ways in which it moves. So one of the things that we realized as we were doing our work together is that there's a need for multiple rituals. No one religious tradition, no one religious community can have ownership on the rituals that we need to heal as a country or as a city or as a people. We also realize that when we engage in rituals, that they close social distance. By that I mean that when we learn each other's rituals, there's a sense in which we grow together as a community. The third thing that we did is that we found that rituals have a way of making the secular sacred. By that I mean that when you do a ritual, everyday life is transformed. And this doesn't mean that we are trying to push a religious point on artists or the art world, but it means that people can be transformed through a ritual so that they see their space differently as, in some sense, holy place, as a holy space. So Requiem for Douglas changed the space of the Douglas Towers from a site of demolition to a site of dignity by practicing those rituals. And then, actually that was pretty much my other point that I was going to make. So yes, we're moving on. So Art as Ritual was this big thing that we were going to do. And what I want to do is to actually step back and do a little bit of the history of ritual, because art is always contextually dependent. By that I mean art always assumes a context, a social context that the artist is speaking to. It creates a dialogue. Oftentimes art makes a connection, and sometimes art will cross a boundary. And so to see how this is, I want you to look at ritual and contemporary art and see a little bit of what it means for art to have been in ritual studies from the beginning. So back in the early days, over the last 70 or so years, this is a really early piece, artists began to explore ritual. This is Maya Deren, an early filmmaker. Again, another one of her pieces. This is Chris Burden's Transfixed, in which he was pinned to a VW that was revving its engine like a crucifix. All of these artists would engage in ritual as a way of protesting a social context that they believed was violent, sexist, racist, overly commodified, individualistic. And rituals for them were a way of getting access to this primitive past that was incredibly powerful. And they wanted to make a kind of visceral point with their work. They wanted not only to get you with your head, but also kind of stir at your heart. And this meant that a lot of our people who did rituals actually had a kind of antagonistic relationship with their audience. Like the surrealists and the Dadaists and the futurists that preceded them, they didn't want just an audience to enjoy a show. They wanted the audience to, in some ways, be cornered morally by what they were doing. They wanted that audience to be transformed as a result of what they were doing. So here's another piece. This is more recent. This is Coco Fusco, 1992, in which he was doing something. This is Judy Chicago, Andy Goldsworthy, and Nick Cave was going to be one of the artists at the conference. And this is one of his first sound suits that he did, which was a response to the Rodney King beatings. So Cave was walking along and praying, as it were, after the Rodney King beatings, and he was trying to think about a way to think about African American visibility, and not as something that was a threat, but something to be celebrated, as something that was here, something that was alive. And so this was his first sound suit that he did. So, Matthew Barney. But if we were to really step back and try to begin things, many people start the serious engagement in contemporary art with ritual with Yves Klein, who was a French artist, and this was from his this is hard to say, anthropometries of the Blue period in 1962. And Klein had this movement in which he, in front of a very well-dressed group of people, he worked with blue, and he would actually paint. He'd have these nude models drench themselves in thick blue paint. And then the models would press themselves up against the painting to make what he called art. And so this is an early film of that period, of the models going up and pressing themselves. Now, Klein was trying to draw attention to the performance of the body in art. And he wanted to kind of take the brush out of his hands and use the model as his brush. But many people found his work problematic to the core. Turning women into paintbrushes is not normally a good message to send. And so people tend to see this in retrospect as a bit problematic. Another piece, something happened here. I'll just keep going. Another piece that got a lot of attention was in 1963, Yoko Ono, who did this piece called Cut Piece, in which she sat on the floor, and the audience came up and took scissors and cut off pieces of her dress. And this was meant to make a feminist case of being violated. But at the same time, Ono is doing something incredibly artistically powerful in that where Klein was using women as paintbrushes, Ono was the artist who was giving art without any kind of intermediary, without the paintbrush, without the canvas, without anything except for how she was being filmed. Another piece is The Serpent from the Open Theater. This was a major breakthrough that happened in 1970. And the Open Theater was an alternative theater company that was founded in New York City. And the whole onus of the Open Theater was to create a kind of transformation of space and a transformation of the artist and the art. So the director of the Open Theater, Jean-Claude Manitali, said that he wanted to transform his actors into priests, and the audience into a congregation, and they wove together the biblical account of Genesis, the fall from grace, the murder of Abel by Cain, with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and then the actors' own improvisations from their deep experience. And so the Serpent in some ways was an incredible breakthrough piece in terms of art as ritual performance. Another incredibly important artist is Ana Medienda from 1974. This is Body Tracks that she did. She worked with a lot of elemental things like blood, in which she would make blood on things. But this piece in particular was considered incredibly transitional. So Mendieta does this piece after a classmate of hers at the University of Iowa is brutally raped and murdered. And so she does this 3-minute silent video in which blood forms at her scalp and runs down her face. And that, of course, is an image of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating blood, going through a kind of crucifixion. But where the serpent and where Ono wanted to kind of come together to kind of create a way in which people could see themselves and have some kind of integration, what Mendieta wanted to communicate was not just the power of rituals, but also their the way they reveal different layers. Because not only do you see this as a religious icon in the Catholic tradition of this bleeding saint, right, or bleeding Jesus, but it also is from her own roots in Cuba, because in the Cuban belief system, the Santeria priest would embed knowledge through a special rite in which he would make an incision at the scalp, and the blood that would flow from that wound through the incision at the scalp would be a symbol of the power of life over death. So it's a powerful piece that she did, and a remarkable piece for all of the things that she brought up. Another incredibly important artist of this time period, and this is from 1972, is Betty Saar. And this, she got a lot of notoriety for this early piece called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. And what it is she collected these collages of Aunt Jemima, the familiar figure that got used to push so much product. And she redrew it in a box. She kind of put the collage in the background, she built this, and she had Aunt Jemima hold a broom on one hand and a rifle on the other. And that was to, both of those are ritual objects, right? The rifle signifies defense, but the broom is not just domesticity. It's meant to be a kind of sweeping away, right? Brooms were used to prepare threshing floors for the separation of the wheat from the chaff, right? And in 1973 or so, she began to experiment with altars. So she began to build altars, and this is part of a retrospective that was done at the Studio Museum of Harlem in 1980 called Rituals. And this is Mti, which is a Swahili for tree, which is obviously a reference to the Yoruba myth of the tree of life that is in everybody. So her rituals began to be seen as both a personal remembrance, but also a public monument. And so this was a key moment. And at one point, at one exhibit, she encouraged people to give sacrifices before the altar. So people left money and jewelry and things like that began to be part of the scene. There's another one, Indigo Mercy, which is another great piece that Betty Saar did. In other words, I bend, but I will not break. Here you have the ritual of domesticity, but it's also a ritual of protest. The last person I want to look at is Marina Abramovich, and this is from Rhythm Zero, and this was from an incredible performance piece that was done in Naples, Italy, in I think 1974. And what Marina Abramovich wanted to do is she kind of revisited all of this work with ritual, and she wanted to convey the sense in which the body is vulnerable through these experiences. And so she laid out 72 objects on a table, and the only instruction she gave the audience was that you could do anything you want with these objects with me. I am an object for the next 6 hours. And so people began tenderly, and then sometimes provocatively, and by the end of the evening it became violent. This is what she said.
I put on the table 72 objects with the instructions, I'm an object, you can do whatever you want to do with me, and I will take all responsibility for 6 hours. And in the beginning, nothing really happened. People would come, they would play with me, they would give me rolls, they would kiss me, look at me, and then puppy became more and more wild. They cut my neck and drink my blood. They carry me around, put me on the table, open my legs, and put a knife between The one person took the pistol, put the bullet. I see if I really with my own hand push the target. They took scissors, they cut my clothes, they put rose pins into my body. After 6 hours, which was like 2 in the morning, the galleries come and say the performance is over. I start moving. I start being myself because I was there like a puppet just for them. At that moment, everybody ran away. People could not actually confront with me as a person. I remember going back to the hotel, looking in the mirror, and I found a big piece of white hair.
Such a powerful image for me of how human society, but also how art in a weird way can image the crucifixion, right? So as soon as she stopped the performance, everybody ran away. They suddenly came to themselves. They couldn't confront her as a person. So all of these artists that I've reviewed, all of these artists are incredibly important, but they all tended to work with an idea of ritual in which it was this kind of residue from the past that was powerful, but largely out of place in contemporary life. And so when they did this kind of work, it was always pushing the limits of social convention. Those of you who have come here for the first time to an adult forum, we won't do a lot of this kind of stuff. I just want to let you know. I do it to provide some context because it's important for you to see where ritual was. And part of the problem that I had with it is not so much the body politics or the visceral nature of it or anything like that, but it's more that the understanding of ritual that they had was incredibly out of place with what ritual was for so many people. It was kind of this antique residue and not something that people use in everyday life to negotiate where they are in the here and now. Because I think that people do rituals not just in ancient times, but I believe people do rituals now to get through our day. And to pull from that, I'll just draw from some people that have done some really important things. You know, ritual is a framed event, said Irving Goffman. In every moment, in everyday life, when you and I meet another person, when we shake hands or not for religious purposes, we're engaging in a ritual. We're presenting ourselves. And we're presenting ourselves usually as our best selves. We dress up in a black suit and try to convey to you that we're holy, or something like that. Rituals are also, a kind of social drama. There's a kind of dramatic nature to a ritual. Victor Turner, an early ritualist, said that rituals were part of a social drama in which there were 4 parts, in which there was the breach, the crisis, the redress, and the resolution. So in the community, you'd have competition or you'd have conflict, and that would be the breach, and that would cause the community to have a crisis. And then in the redressive stage, the community would try out rituals to somehow bring peace to a situation. And then finally, you have the reintegration phase in which people either come together as a community or they fall apart or go their separate ways. So rituals are incredibly important for Turner. Rituals are also restored behavior. And this is what Richard Schechner, a performance artist and also a performance theorist, writes that in every ritual, there's always both a tension between what is being embodied and what potentially might be embodied. So Eucharist is never complete and full in and of itself because there's always more meaning in a Eucharist that could take place. In addition, people are never completely the role they play in a ritual. There's always a tension between that person and the person they're becoming. I was giving a little presentation on this to some clergy earlier this month, or actually it was August. And I said that the meaning of this is that, you know, as a clergy person, you want to be Christ conscious. You want to have a Christ consciousness, but you don't want a Christ complex. You don't become Jesus when you're a priest, but you become aware of playing a role that makes Jesus present. And finally, you have ritual as a reminder of relatedness and a communal resource. When we do rituals today, when we engage in them, we're doing them as a way to remind ourselves that we're fundamentally relational. And this is why lament is such an important ritual, because lamentation is a moment in which we are reminded how close we are and how much our own identity is bound up into the identity of another. This is why when an authoritarian government wants to suppress and oppress a people, they will make funerals, public funerals, illegal. Right? Because if the community has a chance to do a public funeral, they'll come back together again and new leadership will arise. Right? And so that's part of what is involved when in the positive sense, with rituals as a reminder of relatedness and communal resource. So we have put together this conference, and that's giving you a little bit about why we're doing what we're doing, because we want to try to think about ritual differently than maybe what was the case totally in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. We wanted to create and gather together artists at the DIA who are actually doing these kinds of ritual that are more informed by this contemporary understanding. And by saying that, I'm not saying that they are completely indebted to Victor Turner or Irving Guffman or Richard Schechner or the people I've mentioned. I mean that work helps us understand what's going on in Detroit today. And to further clarify a little bit, we're looking at art as ritual and not ritual art. By that I mean ritual art is the kind of material culture that surrounds a religion. And so this is a beautiful piece from the 19th century Kufic script. It's from the Quran, and it's from the collection at the DIA. And this is a beautiful piece, but this is ritual as art. The beautiful chalice, and some would say baptismal font we use as a ciborium up at the altar that we all know so well, is a beautiful piece of ritual as art. But it's not an example of art as ritual. An example of art as ritual is perhaps Yale Bartana, who's going to be there tomorrow. And she did this incredible film called Inferno, in which she recreates in a different kind of way a multi-ethnic temple. And so here is the priestly blessing of Yom Kippur being done by someone who, in a community that isn't in any sense of the normal definition, Jewish. We also focused on rituals as an end rather than on the process of art making. By that I mean, here you have an example of ritual in the process, and this is called Injustice Case by David Hammonds, and he's an influential artist, and in his early work, he liked to work with symbols. So this happened as a kind of protest to the trial of Bobby Seale, the Black Panther. And so Hammonds put himself through this incredible contortion and took a picture of himself in this way to speak to the plight of African Americans during the trial of Bobby Seale. And he layered it over on top of the American flag as a kind of way of making a huge point. But all of the ritual involved in this happens in the process of making this piece of art. Once it's here, it kind of just speaks. As opposed to his more recent work called Blizzard Ball, in which he made, I think I saw this once, I hope I'm not imagining it, outside of Cooper Union in New York City, he would put out snowballs in the midst of winter that he would sell for different prices according to the size. And this is a commentary on the nature of the art world, that there's an emptiness to the art world, to the commodification of the galleries that he was speaking to. And also, again, in a kind of more playful way, he's saying, he said he couldn't find something whiter than a snowball. And so he was talking about the strange premium placed on whiteness in this world. Why is it that, whiteness is considered something you would buy? You can buy it just as is, even if it's ephemeral. And so this is an example of where the ritual has been embedded in what he's doing. I tend to prefer Injustice Case as a work of art, but I think that this signifies the shift that we see going on in many of the artists that we're working with. We've also focused on art as ritual rather than art about ritual. And by that I mean, you know, this is from Matthew Barney's massive work, River of Fundament. And in it, it's a multiple hour film. There's a lot of screaming, there's a lot of nudity, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of destruction. You've got this going on. You've got some bizarre rituals going on. This is kind of a continuation of that tradition of using ritual as a way to get at the kind of visceral level of people. I find it interesting in a historic way. This would not be something I would look into to improve myself. But I would consider seeing Jennifer Harge, who's a local Detroit-based dancer who does Harge dance stories. And she tries to embody and do these wonderful, incredible dance movements that bring together memory and history and narrative about what it means to be African American in Detroit. So this is art as ritual, as opposed to Barney's art about ritual. We also want to look at rituals as a way to negotiate everyday life. So Herman Nietzsche, who started doing this in 1962, but continued doing it until 2003, would have these elaborate scenes in which he would use theater blood and animal carcasses and carry people around in these mock crucifixions. And that was meant to find ways to kind of get again at the kind of visceral nature of things. But in fact, everyday life, and this is another one, orgies, mysteries, theaters is what they're called. I mean, look at them just soaked in blood. But more interesting to me are people like Billy Mark, who's a performance artist in Detroit as well, a Kresge award-winning artist. And what Billy does is he's a performance artist. He's also a profound Christian who lives in a Christian community. And what he does is he had this kind of mock wrestling training in which he went and then wrestled himself at 8 Mile to symbolize the ways in which people see that as a barrier that needs to be transcended. We focused on public rituals rather than personal rituals because, you know, there's a lot of people doing art as a personal ritual. This is Olivier de Sagazan. He's from the Congo, and this is a ritual about self-creation in which he takes himself and he wraps himself in clay and straw, and he kind of tries to become a new person. And it's all about how he's trying to get at who he is through his artistic practice. The artists that we're interested in are people who are more interested in mining rituals as a way to find out and communicate a message. So we're using Viva Bell, who is another Detroit-based artist, to talk about how she uses ritual not merely for self-expression, but to convey a message. And then we look for rituals that create sacred space rather than commodify, justify, or legitimate an agenda, or I should say an agenda. And so there you have Z Garage, which was done by Mr. Gilbert. It's a wonderful garage. I've parked there. It's lovely. This is all great art. And Z Garage is incredibly beautiful. If you ever get downtown, you should just park there for the fun of it. There's a nice little bar there called Punch Bowl, which you can bowl and have some alcohol if you need it. And the nice thing about this is it's beautiful, but truly the art there is instrumental. The purpose of that art is to get you to park in Z Garage, right? It's art that's been commodified. And when we're more interested in art that is prophetic and is trying to convey a point and to tell a disruptive truth, if gently or differently than perhaps the early ritualists. So that is what we're doing with art as ritual. And the question we're going to have is, how do we participate in this conference? And what we've done with Art as Ritual is we've brought together these international artists, and we've brought together these Detroit-based artists, and we've brought together performers, and we've brought together academics And we've brought together members of the interfaith community because we believe in the collision of those cultures and communities and the meeting of those people, that we can actually begin to imagine something differently about the city. Because art does have an important role to play in our social imaginations. It is on the edge of things for me as a priest to be doing this. Notice I hardly mention God or Jesus. So it's at my edge of my comfort zone. As you know, I really do love Jesus. But it is what I'm trying to do. And we're doing it at a museum because museums are always places in which people are ritually formed. They give you an ideal. They tell you how to proceed. Have you ever noticed that people whisper in museums? Why do they need to whisper? Is the art listening? I'm just always wondering. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're doing it in a museum because we're trying to create the museum as a site for rethinking who we are as individuals and communities. That's it. Freaked out?
No. You whisper because you don't want to interrupt
Other people, you're right, Sarah.
intercourse with.
You're absolutely right.
It's a clever anecdote.
What's that?
It's a clever anecdote.
Yes.
It's a ritual.
Yes, it's a ritual. Any questions or about the general thing? So next week what we're going to do is we'll have Andy Doyle is going to give a presentation on spirituality and art. Yeah, please.
This sort of makes you think about the service itself and how the service is more than just the service. I think we need to think about that more when we're upstairs in the service itself too. Go beyond just the service.
Well, that's the one thing that I really enjoyed about doing this project is it forced me to rethink things, but it also forces me to think about what we do as inside the church services completely differently, deeper than before. So it is. Y'all are normally so chatty, you make me nervous. What's going on?
I think I understand what you're going to be doing tomorrow, but I don't understand where the art is. If I saw a toddler throwing a tantrum, would that be art?
It is hard to figure out some days. Because I was telling people, so somebody said to me, why do you do performance art? And I'm like, because I don't get it. Like, I don't understand it on some levels. There'll be times in which I'll watch performance and I'm like, this is not making an impact on me at all. But I'm really interested in it because you sometimes have to commit. I mean, the problem with contemporary art, and I'll probably say this in 2 weeks' time, is it makes enormous demands on the viewer. Right, so you have to have a background and you have to have a level of commitment to hear what's being said. And maybe part of the reason why I love the movement every day that Orrin and I are trying to push is it actually reduces that distance. You don't have to be an art critic to experience Requiem for Douglas. When you watch Jennifer Harge dance or Biba is a little more demanding because she's trained, she's from Romania, and it's, I don't know, it's intense. Like watching her dance, it's intense. I keep waiting for the rhythm.
Romania is intense.
Yes, Romania is intense.
But she's reflecting.
She's reflecting. Any others? So I think that, in the past people would say that there was this part of our bodies, and this is Aristotle, that was able to appraise beauty. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is I'm not sure how fixed that is in our life. By that I mean, think about an African mask. We would take an African mask and place it on a wall. And behind that are all sorts of assumptions we make about beauty. But the person who made that mask, if it was made for ritual purposes, would never treat a mask that way. The mask would embody their ancestors. It would be something that you would use only within the ritual. It would be your special thing to harbor
Honor.
and honor and keep. And so when we know both of that, then we start to think about all the ways we think about beauty. It actually does us a favor because it helps us interrogate, because our standards for beauty can actually be a way that keeps others from being near us. And it keeps us from appreciating things. So I think it's always good to test it. But when I go to the DIA, I'll be honest, I go through the contemporary wing, it's every other one that I'll think, wow. And many of them I'll think, I don't get it. I'm going to have to do some study. Great story.
I just came from a person who was married to someone who was sent to work with Inuits, lived in Big Britain for 9 years, 10 years, and helped the Inuits in Baffin Island to create an art trade. This was way back. From there, he went to a designer for Stupid, which is just so so crazy, life change. And I was thinking about their art, the Inuit art. Whenever I look at it, that which is really gorgeous, I wonder about ritual as opposed to a spiritual appreciation for what has been created by God. So I'm having a lot of trouble with the idea of ritual as opposed to, I don't know, some kind of designation or creation representing God's creation.
Yeah, well, and that's a great question. I guess for me, I think that the power of ritual is that it's always all around us. And when you shift your attention to ritual, you begin to see it as far more important and influential than sometimes the objects we see. Right? Because we have ways in which we venerate certain objects. And we know what they are by the way we treat them. If you were to ask an anthropologist who was from outer space or another entirely different culture to come in and just watch what we do, the way they would understand what we value, they'd watch how we behave. They actually wouldn't be able to read the piece and say, well, that's a beautiful piece of art. They would observe us. So the rituals can unpack different things that I think is really important. And then also, there's a generosity in ritual. And that when you are experiencing profound disintegration, where you don't know where God is, sometimes just going through the ritual can be its own kind of salve. Right? So one person that I use in an academic piece I'm writing on this does Holocaust studies. And he observed how there was a continuation of prayers at Auschwitz. Even though the faith in God was completely compromised, they continued to pray because they knew if they continued to pray, there was a sense in which God would somehow, sooner or later, reveal God's self.
Resurrect.
Yeah, resurrection. So rituals are powerful. And I promise you this is not going to be an entire class on ritual. So if you all are freaked out for today, and you are going to go quiet, please come back. But I think it is important because when we look at icons, you have to keep in mind that icons are not just pretty. Right? Icons were used ritually. People experienced the presence of God at an icon, which is why you actually didn't, icons were never signed by the artist. Right? Icons are considered living or dead by the church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it's because they used them ritually. Right? So that's where their power was. Anyways, we got to stop, but thank you all for being so patient.
Good luck.